indebted to the Gale and Parker Gilbert Fund, the Eugene V. and Claire E. Thor Charitable Trust, an anonymous foundation, the Diane W. and Claire E. Sorry, I've said that one already. There's so many of them. The Diane W. and James E. Burke Fund, and the Janice H. Levin Fund. And the exhibition is supported by indemnity from the Federal Council of the Arts and Humanities. Now, our speaker this evening is Professor Michael Leja, James and Nan Wagner Farquhar Professor of the History of Art at the University of Pennsylvania. Michael is best known for his numerous groundbreaking essays and books on the visual arts in the United States, mostly in the 19th and 20th centuries. His prize-winning Reforming Abstract Expressionism, Subjectivity in Painting in the 1940s was first published in 1993. His most recent book, Art of the United States, 1750 to 2000, Primary Sources, which he co-authored with John Davis, came out in 2020, and he's currently completing A Flood of Pictures, the formation of a picture culture in the US, 1830 to 1860, which sounds fascinating. But particularly relevant to this lecture this evening is another brilliant and award-winning book, Looking Askance, Skepticism and American Art from Eakins to Duchamp, which was first published in 2004. And I'm happy to say that it's available to read online if you haven't got a copy of it, and that's also true of his book about abstract expressionism. Now, the Duchamp book, Looking Askance, culminated in a final chapter on Duchamp, and on several of the very provocative works that Duchamp produced just after he arrived in America for the first time in 1915. And the apt and intriguing title of tonight's lecture is Motes to Trouble the Mind's Eye, Marcel Duchamp and Trompe. And he's very kindly agreed to answer questions at the end of the lecture if time permits. So I would ask you now to welcome him to give his talk.
Thank you, Lizzie, for that very kind introduction. And thanks to you and Emily for inviting me to participate in the conversations around that wonderful exhibition you've got upstairs. I'll refer to it in many places, but it really has opened my eyes to some really important insights into the connections between Duchamp and the Cubists. So I'll be telling you about some of those tonight. So my title comes from the most quoted text in Western culture, Shakespeare's Hamlet, the moment early in the play when Horatio, Hamlet's old friend, has seen a ghost. What appears to be the ghost of Hamlet's father, the recently deceased king of Denmark. Horatio's mind is reeling, trying to understand what he has seen, whether he has seen something, and whether to tell Hamlet about it. And in that state, he says of the ghost, "A mote it is to trouble the mind's eye." So this evening, I want to speak of motes and the mind's eye in relation to Cubism and to the work of an artist not included in the current exhibition, Marcel Duchamp. I think the curators made the right choice in not including him, although he was part of a Cubist group early on. And he was part of a Cubist group early on, but he became an apostate and was quoted in an art magazine in 1915 saying, quote, "That word Cubism means nothing at all. Their favorite word is discipline. It means everything to them and nothing," unquote. And later in 1959, he told artist Richard Hamilton about his early affiliation with the Cubists, saying, quote, "Very soon I felt an impatience with Cubism, at least impatience in that I couldn't see any future for me in it." Despite these disavowals, I agree with the curators also that Duchamp should be brought into the conversation around this show because his most important work was deeply enmeshed in issues that are central to it. The Cubist paintings, let me get the title slide up there. There we go. The Cubist paintings featured in this exhibition and Duchamp's works were meant to be irritations to the mind's eyes of viewers, not just their body's eyes. How were Duchamp's motes different from those of the Cubists? And how might different conceptions of the mind's eye be in play here? I want to look closely at some of Duchamp's works to address these questions, works that highlight particularly prominently the question, is what I am looking at a real thing or a representation? That was the question always salient in trompe-l'oeil paintings, none more so than in this example by Jefferson Chalfant, which is in the current exhibition. Which is which? Which is the actual stamp collaged onto the painted wood panel, and which is the painted replica? This challenge is presented to viewers in a painted imitation of a clipping from a newspaper placed below the stamps. Abrasion of the actual stamp on the left, which was more easily damaged by rubbing, reveals that many viewers resorted to tactile examination to resolve the issue. While the painting sets up a witty game that playfully engages spectators, it also raises the specter of counterfeits. Underlying the question which is which are others less playful, such as, how will you manage in a marketplace in a world where you cannot visually discern truth from illusion? And another question, why might eroding the boundary between illusion and reality be a valuable function for art? Cubism's congruences and intersections with trompe-l'oeil paintings are laid out thoroughly by the co-curators in the current exhibition and catalog. The Cubists, too, considered their art a kind of realism and placed questions about truth and falsehood at the center of their work. As Picasso said in the mid-1940s to François Gillot, his partner at the time, we always had the idea that we were realists. One of the fundamental points about Cubism is this: not only did we try to displace reality, reality was no longer the object. Reality was in the painting, end quote. To prepare the way for comparison with Duchamp, I'll use these two paintings to illustrate the engagement of Cubist art with trompe-l'oeil painting. These two are not included in the exhibition, although they are in the catalog, and they are the bookends in the catalog essay by Emily Braun. Braque's Picture and Violin on the left is an early Cubist picture containing evident trompe-l'oeil devices. At the top center, a nail defines a small area of more conventional illusionistic space, a disruption in the spatial order of the painting. I think you can see it here. It casts a shadow, and below it, a folded corner on a large oblique plane. I'm talking about this corner on the plane, this plane, is also casting a shadow, which constitutes another characteristic motif of trompe-l'oeil. Cubism had contradictory purposes in importing trompe-l'oeil devices, as the exhibition demonstrates persuasively. On one hand, trompe-l'oeil painting was an ally in provoking meditation on representation and on the relation of a representation to the material thing being represented. On the other, it was a convenient target for parody as an example of the facile, superficial illusionism against which Cubism defined itself. So trompe-l'oeil painting was simultaneously enemy and ally of Cubism. Note that this nail, folded corner, and their shadows are bloodless caricatures of trompe-l'oeil. The head of the nail is open to the surface below, which prevents it from projecting as forcefully from the picture plane as it might. The protrusion of the folded corner, too, is undermined by a darker facet behind it. I hope you can see that. Oop, I've lost my laser dot. Oh well, just to the left of the folded corner, I hope you can see the darkened facet that compromises its relief. Moreover, the shadows of the nail and the folded corner fall in opposite directions, as if lit from diametrically opposed sources, subverting any convincing illusion of real forms in continuous space. Picasso's guitar, from 16 years later, on the right, contains a real nail hammered into the wood support, as if pinning up the lighter of the brown sheets of paper. Real string, wound around real carpet tacks, stands for the strings of the guitar, whose drawn features extend across both sheets of collaged paper. In this painting, Emily Braun writes in the catalog, the musical instrument hangs on a real nail that casts a real shadow on a real wood panel, the history of trompe-l'oeil seemingly brought to conclusion by this ready-made. With this invocation of the ready-made, that's the end of the quote, by the way. With this invocation of the ready-made, Marcel Duchamp makes his entrance into the story. He would very likely have wanted to claim that the ready-made had put paid to the history of trompe-l'oeil some years earlier. There we go. At the chronological midpoint between these two works by Braque and Picasso is Duchamp's Tomb, done in 1918, an ambitious and shrewd picture that is not cubist, but that concentrates on what I am calling the trompe-l'oeil question. Furthermore, it gathers other kinds of visual signs that can pose this same question without hyper-illusionism, the distinctive feature of trompe-l'oeil's version. Tomb collects enough of these other semiotic instruments to orchestrate a visual symphony around the theme, is what I am looking at a real thing or a representation? I'll take us through these varied instruments without getting mired in semiotic classifications and explanations for them, although we can certainly explore those later if we're so inclined. The narrow horizontal format of this painting, over 10 feet long, was specified by Catherine Dreyer, an influential collector and patron of avant-garde art, who commissioned it from Duchamp for the library of her New York apartment. This later photograph showing her library relocated to her Connecticut home gives some idea of how the painting must have appeared originally in New York. The title of the work, Tomb, is an incomplete statement in French. It contains the beginning of the phrase, "You do something to me," where something is implied by the apostrophe but left unstated. Duchamp explicitly said that the title as given made no sense, and that it invited viewers, quote, to add whatever verb they want as long as it began with a vowel, which is signaled by the contraction of me, the M-E, to the M apostrophe. Let's go back to the picture. The words most often supplied instinctively by French commentators were the French words for bore and annoy. You bore me, you annoy me. Such associations are probably right, insofar as they imagine Duchamp speaking to Dreyer. He did not try to conceal the fact that he did not want this commission, but felt he had to accept it to satisfy the wishes of his friend and supporter. Also, he might have directed the terms bore and annoy toward painting at this time, since it no longer held interest for him. He had not made a painting in the preceding 5 years, and this one was to be his last, and not even entirely a painting. I'm going to argue that we can recognize a fundamental difference between Duchamp and the Cubists by looking at the ways they use trompe-l'oeil devices. For the Cubists, these were tools, operating as both ally and foil, for giving their work a new purchase on truth and reality. For Duchamp, trompe-l'oeil motifs could assist in discrediting painting, revealing it as a medium riddled with deceptions and conundrums, inadequate for questioning the foundational assumptions of Western art, which was his project. But for all of these artists, the playful wit of trompe-l'oeil was irresistible. Tomb makes explicit reference to several of Duchamp's earlier works, but not to any of his prior paintings or the styles in which they were made. Cubist, futurist, biomorphic, or mechanomorphic, none of these are evident in the picture. Here, a heterogeneous collection of forms is arrayed across a nebulous field, each projecting a particular sort of pictorial space, and each with a distinct way of posing some version of the trompe-l'oeil question. Very near the center of the painting, a bright yellow parallelogram rotated to place its corners at compass points, forming a diamond shape, marks the foremost plane of a stack of identically oriented colored shapes. The first 20 or so cast a shadow over the one behind, along their top left edge, which inserts space between them and indicates lighting from below, left, and in front. These recede into the distance in precise linear perspective along a rising diagonal toward a vanishing point at the upper left corner of the picture, where they fade into the background. Here's a detail. The head of a real fastener inserted at the center of the yellow swatch suggests that all of them are bound together in some sort of deck. While these colored planes are fundamentally geometric abstractions, their accordion pleating broadly evokes color samples from an art supply or house paint company, like these period examples. That resemblance may move us to reflect on the ambiguous status of these swatches. They are literal color samples, conveniently arrayed for comparative purposes, and they could function to assist in making color evaluations or choices. Without giving us a hyper-illusionistic rendering of a color chart, Duchamp has presented a version of the trompe-l'oeil question. Are these literal color samples, or are they likenesses of colored objects, real or abstract? The shadows may tilt the balance toward the latter in this case. In striking contrast to the multicolored diamonds is the line of shadows that extends across the painting, defining a bicycle wheel, a corkscrew, and a hat rack. Duchamp told an interviewer that he used a projector to throw shadows of some of his recent ready-mades on the canvas, which he then traced by hand. The bicycle wheel and the hat rack were selected a year earlier by Duchamp for relocation from the category commercial commodity to work of art. That is, they became ready-mades. And they bookend the picture, both presented as if the product of more or less frontal illumination. The shadow of the corkscrew, however, is elongated, as if it had been illuminated lengthwise from the top down. When Tomb was painted, the corkscrew had not yet officially been declared a ready-made, but responding to a query from an interviewer in 1968, Duchamp retrospectively declared the shadow a ready-made. Note that the handle of the corkscrew is foreshortened slightly so that the bottom is wider than the top, which pushes the top back a bit into the distance. These painted shadows behave oddly, as Thierry Lenin has noted. The line of the color swatches is made to pass through the shadow of the wheel, which attributes to the shadow an incongruous material volume. Similarly, the handle of the corkscrew is transparent at the top to the pink swatch behind it, but at the bottom it obscures the sleeve of the hand with the pointing finger. When this painting is seen under normal lighting conditions, as opposed to a professionally lit photograph, as you see here, that finger points to a real shadow that joins the represented ones. So this is a picture I took in the galleries where the real shadow is evident. It's obliterated in professional photographs. This slide has terrible color. Sorry about that, but it has great materiality. So there's a plus here. The real shadow, which emulates the shadow of the corkscrew and brackets the pointing finger, is cast by the bottle brush that can be seen extending from a hole in the tear in the canvas. Okay, we're back here. So right here you see a little hole from which this wire is protruding. And that's what that is. That's that bottle brush sticking out from the picture. I'll come back to that other slide in a minute. In official professional photographs of the painting, the shadow of the bottle brush is washed out. As you see again here, you can see the shadow of the handle, but not the brush. And this is an interesting picture, just because you can see, now I've lost the laser again. Well, it comes and it goes. Oh, there it is. Okay, you see these there are very faint lines spreading out from the handle on both sides, 5 or 6 of them, which tells us that there were, oh, thank you, great, thanks so much. Oh, there we go. So you see right here, there are these little lines spreading out from the handle, and you can see them on this side as well. Those are the 5 or 6 photographers' lights that were propped on either side of the picture that obliterated the very important shadow of the brush from the painting. So here, let's go back to the normal lighting conditions, under which, I mean, the positioning of that real shadow will vary depending on how the lighting is set up, but it will usually land within the vicinity of the pointing finger. Real shadow and illusory shadow are juxtaposed, and the pointing finger forces the issue. Duchamp commissioned a commercial sign painter to paint this hand and encouraged him to sign it just below the wrist. Of course, he was capable of painting this himself, but in addition to increasing the heterogeneity of the imagery in the painting, the commissioned hand introduces another manifestation of the trompe-l'oeil question. Is this hand an actual sign directing me or my attention to move right, or is it a representation of a sign detached from its ordinary function? With regard to the shadows that frame the hand, note again, Duchamp does not rely on a hyper-illusionistic painted shadow, that is a truly trompe-l'oeil shadow, to pose the trompe-l'oeil question. In fact, counterposing the real shadow to a schematically painted one that has strange powers of selective transparency and opacity might encourage closer comparison of the real and the represented. The Cubist painters, too, made shadows prominent players in their compositions, as the current exhibition explains clearly. Striking counterparts to Tomb in this respect include pears and grapes on a... Oops, okay, I meant to give you that detail earlier, but this picture, pears and grapes on a table by Juan Gris, in which a wine glass and clusters of grapes are sectioned off into illuminated, middle-toned, grayed out, that is, so these grapes, for example, are sectioned off seemingly arbitrarily into illuminated, shadowed, and some middle-toned gray ones down below. These areas are arbitrarily related to one another, displaced from one another in some cases. And they are detached from one another in some cases, such as the wine glass. You see the shadow here of the wine glass that appears here, which has illuminated color there and a grayed attachment, apparently, to the base of it below. The pears in the bowl are only silhouettes in a lighted bowl, and a knife in the lower left corner likewise seems to have no illuminated counterpart. It's just a shadow in the picture. But the referential dynamics of the painting lead me to look for the counterparts to the dark shapes within the space of the picture, not in exterior real space, as Tomb does. Picasso's cup of coffee is also pertinent here, a picture that's in the exhibition and I really encourage you to see. Insofar as it includes real shadows cast by some of the materials in the painting. The blue sheet with the emphatic shadow along its puckered edge, which you see in the detail on the left, is deliberately left separated from its ground, and a large charcoal area extends underneath to mix real and illusionistic shadow. The lower edge of the white cup form also lifts from the surface. Many of the paper attachments lift from this surface. But in the white cup, the real and charcoal shadow are adjacent to one another. The real shadows in Cubist collages, radical though they are, appear understated, even tasteful, by comparison with the outrageous brush shadow in Tomb. Duchamp made a habit of pushing to their limits the innovations of modernist painting, as well as of trompe-l'oeil illusionisms. All right, between the shadows of the corkscrew and the hat rack is a jagged tear in the canvas in Tomb, parts of which appear to have been cleanly cut by a knife. You see it near the corkscrew handle, there's a very clean cut. And parts have ragged edges as if ripped under pressure. The bottle brush emerges from the right side, implying that it might have played some part in causing the split, whether by bursting through from behind or puncturing from the front. This is the place in the painting where Duchamp puts his own painting skills to the service of true trompe-l'oeil effects. The tear is a painted illusion, as are the ripples that indicate buckling of the canvas above and below the tear. The 3 safety pins mending the tear, however, are real. The brush protrudes not from the tear, but from a circumscribed hole directly above a twisting white plane set obliquely in the picture. The highest and the lowest of the 4 corners of this plane appear to be the nearest, which is problematic since they are on opposite sides of the sheet. Looking at the bottom edge, the left side projects forward. Looking at the top edge, the right side seems nearer. This dizzying, spatially oscillating plane becomes the backdrop for the bottle brush when the painting is seen at eye level and straight on, as in this slide. The wavy brown forms at bottom left, which are reprised as red and black lines at the right, you see it at the right side of the picture, refer to another of Duchamp's prior works, the 3 standard stoppages from 1913-14, curved lines made by dropping a 1 meter length of sewing thread from a height of 1 meter 3 times, getting 3 different shapes of the thread. The rectilinear meter was thereby converted to undulations, and its length was altered by chance factors. These stoppages were to become Duchamp's proposals for new improved standards of measurement. He affixed each of them to, here, let me show you the stoppages with a detail of the left side of the painting. So these stoppages, the thread was affixed to a piece of glass, which you see here. It's mounted on black background. And the thread was then used to make a template, putting the shape into wood so that it could be repeated, used like a yardstick, a meter stick in this case, to repeat each of the 3 falls of the thread. The other 2 are contained in the case. So presumably the undulating forms on both sides of tomb were made using these wooden templates. Those on the right side of the painting are superimposed on the hat rack shadow. Lines of colored rectangles, another instantiation of color samples, and overlapping circles at different scales recede from the stoppages into depth toward a vanishing point at the bottom edge of the painting directly below the widest part of the split, the illusionistic split in the canvas. Just as the stoppages were physically traced from preserved thread to a wooden strip, so they are transferred here by retracing. At left, they are attached to brown shapes that simulate the templates, and at right, they mingle as overlapping disembodied lines. Once again, the trompe-l'oeil question arises. Are these tracings actual stoppages capable of measurement, however eccentric, with a status something like the measurement scale provided on a map? Or are they essentially representations of the original work by Duchamp? As usual, they're both. So tomb can be understood as an especially dense field of iterations of the trompe-l'oeil question, with and without hyperillusionism. And from this field, the bottle brush projects forward about 2 feet, an exceptional span that tests the limits of an extension that a collaged element can tolerate while still remaining part of the work to which it is attached. The distance here is great enough that a viewer may tend to look past the brush to the painting, or to become annoyed that the brush and its shadow refuse to stay put, but rather skitter around the painting with the slightest changes in viewing position or turn of the spectator's gaze. Moreover, by virtue of joining its real shadow to the painted shadows of other ready-mades in the painting, the bottle brush asserts itself as a ready-made, a real one, as opposed to an implied or absent one. Its emergence seemingly from within the canvas invites us to interpret it as an eruption, a projectile, that has pierced the painting's array of challenges to the idea that images can provide clear and truthful representation. This ready-made is born of the realization that pictorial representation is terminally engulfed in illusions, deceptions, and conundrums. The ready-made, the literal thing, imported into the realm of the aesthetic, it proposes, is a better ground for analysis and critique of art, not least because it does away with the distractions of visual imagery and directs attention fully to the core conceptual problems of representation. Interpreted this way, Tomb becomes a pictorial manifesto embodying positions Duchamp articulated emphatically and repeatedly in interviews and written statements. Above all, he was committed to elevating the conceptual aspects of art above the visual. He spoke with contempt about what he called retinal art, which he believed originated with Courbet. Let me give you one of the many quotes making this statement. So the interviewer says, "You had to invent everything for the first time?" And Duchamp says, "Yes, because as you know, the revolution of Courbet was mainly a visual revolution, what you might call a retinal revolution. He insisted, without even mentioning it, that painting is to be looked at and only looked at, and the reactions should be visual or retinal, plain physical reaction in front of a painting. This has been going on since Courbet and still is in vogue. If you speak to a painter today, he will never think of an anecdote. It's all about the line, the form, the play of colors together, and the more abstract, the better." This account of Courbet is certainly open to question, and the context makes clear that for Duchamp, retinal implies a focus on form. He also made clear that in his choice of ready-mades, conceptual interests superseded visual ones. Here's a quote making that point. Another interviewer, "What determined your choice of ready-mades?" "That depended on the object. In general, I had to beware of its look. It's very difficult to choose an object because at the end of 15 days you begin to like it or to hate it. You have to approach something with an indifference, as if you had no aesthetic emotion. The choice of ready-mades is always based on visual indifference and, at the same time, on the total absence of good or bad taste." Before continuing this discussion of the ready-mades, I should note that the Cubists, too, wanted their art to be understood as conceptual, not merely visual. Their critique of illusionistic representation, in which trompe-l'oeil references were prominent targets, was in service to presenting a conception of the thing represented rather than the mere appearance of that thing. François Gillot reported Picasso saying around 1944 that he and Braque, during their collaborative period, here, let me put this up, "We tried to get rid of trompe-l'oeil, to find a trompe l'esprit. We didn't any longer want to fool the eye, we wanted to fool the mind." This same idea was articulated much earlier, although a bit less definitively, in 1913 by the Cubist painters Glaise and Metzinger in their book on Cubism, in which Duchamp's work was included as an example of Cubism. As Duchamp would do later, they identified Courbet as the initiator of retinal art. One more quotation text. "Courbet inaugurated a realistic impulse which runs through all modern efforts, yet he remained a slave of the worst visual conventions, unaware of the fact that to display a true relation, we must be ready to sacrifice 1,000 apparent truths. He accepted without the slightest intellectual control all that his retina presented to him. He did not suspect that the visible world can become the real world only through the operation of the intellect, and that the objects which most forcibly impress upon us are not always those whose existence is richest in plastic truths. Courbet was like one who observes the ocean for the first time and who, diverted by the movement of the waves, has no thought of the depths." The only reason I contribute to spreading this misinformation about Courbet is because valuable insights into the Cubist project are articulated here. Despite substantial congruence in their assessments, Duchamp and the Cubists meant something quite different when they described their work as conceptual. I'm not aware of Duchamp ever using the term trompe l'esprit, but it is plausible that he would have embraced it. An alternative title for Tomb could be Trompe similarly incomplete, trompe with the L apostrophe, and with l'oeil and l'esprit as possible objects. Take that for what it's worth. In what ways, then, were the ready-mades a conceptual art? The ready-mades a conceptual art? Well, let's talk about those for a minute. Fountain, the most notorious of them, the urinal that Duchamp submitted to the Exhibition of Independent Artists in New York in 1917, was startling because the vulgarity of the object's usual function made it an uncomfortable presence in the spaces of art. By titling it Fountain, Duchamp invited viewers to suppress the ordinary, insistent identity and to try to envision another. If we accept the invitation, we might try to imagine how water might be redirected through this device to make it truly operate as a fountain. We might contemplate how its porcelain arcs and curves would enfold a geyser of water. We might then wonder how it is possible that such a mundane object could be construed as a representation of a fountain through slight alterations, such as reorienting it, titling it, putting a false signature on it, dating it. And this could lead us into quite abstract reflections on the relation of presentation and representation, which is a form of the trompe-l'oeil question. Is what I am looking at a urinal, a presentation of a urinal, or is it, without any significant alteration of its appearance, also a representation, a fountain? In this respect, another comment Picasso made to François Gillot regarding the papier collé is pertinent. Quote, "If a piece of newspaper can become a bottle, that gives us something to think about in connection with both newspapers and bottles too. This displaced object has entered a universe for which it was not made, and where it retains in a measure its strangeness." Unquote. Duchamp identified a category of works he called reciprocal ready-mades, which operated in reverse by exporting a work of art from the aesthetic realm into a utilitarian functional category. The classic example is a painting by Rembrandt used as an ironing board, which exists only as an unrealized idea. But to help you visualize it, I'll give you this Degas painting and try and imagine. If I had better Photoshop skills, I would have superimposed a Rembrandt painting on there, but I don't, so you have to imagine it. This adds some new twists to the questions already raised. Are the operations truly reciprocal? How does converting a representation into a non-art object compare with making a non-art object into a representation? Why is an ironing board a better example in one transformation and a urinal in the other? The famous LHOOQ adds another twist to reciprocal displacement. Excuse me. Certainly this mustachioed Mona Lisa, retitled with a lewd insinuation, is a resounding gesture of ridicule toward an iconic work in the Western artistic canon. But it is also another variation on the trompe-l'oeil question. First of all, there's the question of whether the mustache was applied to the painting, which could have been photographed in its revised condition, or whether it was drawn on the postcard. Once we have ascertained that the disfigured item is not Leonardo's painting, but an inexpensive mass-market reproduction, we can appreciate that the card had already initiated a removal of the image from the category of art with a capital A to commodified art with a small a. That is, it had already undergone a sort of transformation into a reciprocal ready-made, without being so designated. In revising it as his own work, Duchamp restored its capital A. Now hanging in a museum, it presents itself to us as an important work of art by Duchamp, as well as a disfigured postcard that happens to reproduce a venerated painting in the Louvre. It is also akin to a Cubist papier collé in extremis, a single sheet with found imagery whose dimensions are coextensive with those of the completed collage and with minimal applied markings. At least one of Duchamp's ready-mades contains the explicit trompe-l'oeil deception. Why Not Sneeze, Rose c'est la vie, this work is called. It's a quasi-ready-made since it contains a mixture of found and fabricated items. A birdcage, found birdcage, filled with 152 small white cubes, among other things. Duchamp noted that a viewer is likely at first to assume the cubes to be sugar, but either by touching a cube and feeling its coldness, or by lifting the cage and feeling its weight, one discovers that the cubes are actually marble. A thermometer is included among the cubes to call attention to the issue of temperature in this illusion. Duchamp told an interviewer that Why Not Sneeze, quote, wasn't exactly a ready-made except for the cage, and he spoke of having, quote, to do the sugar cubes in marble. Evidently, they were not ready-made. He deliberately fabricated or commissioned the fabrication of trompe-l'oeil sugar cubes for this work in what he called a visual pun. One way to cast the differences between the Cubists and Duchamp in terms of their relation to trompe-l'oeil illusionism is to say that the Cubists designed motes troubling the mind's eye to bring into the realm of pictorial representation more substantial, denser, multidimensional experiences of things in the world, replete with tactile cues and multiple vantage points, than was possible through traditional Western illusionistic representation. The Cubists held out hope that by assigning a larger role to conceptual faculties in assembling fragmentary cues about things, painting could provide new, compelling ways of representing the world that spoke to modern experience. Duchamp, as he said, could not see any future for himself in this project. His motes were designed to establish the inescapable uncertainty, confusion, and deception of pictorial representation. Exposing the idiosyncrasies of the category of art as it came down to the early 20th century in European traditions was a project that did hold a future for him. Dadaist circles, especially the ones in Paris and New York, were more compatible homes for him than Cubist circles. In New York, where most of his ready-mades were produced, the group of artists who gathered around Walter and Louise Arensberg developed an intellectually refined and brilliant variation of the Dada embrace of irrationality, chance, and ridicule, to which Duchamp was the principal contributor. Speaking of New York, let me conclude by pointing to one further difference between Duchamp and the Cubists. As Elizabeth Cowling's essay in the exhibition catalog documents, trompe-l'oeil painting emerged in Europe in the mid-17th century, but by the early 19th century, it was declining in popularity there. As she writes, quote, generally speaking, except in the United States, trompe-l'oeil increasingly became the province of skilled but not professional painters, and, crucially from the Cubist perspective, decorators and commercial artists, end quote. The histories of trompe-l'oeil art in Europe and the US are strikingly divergent in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. While decorators and artisans specializing in wallpaper and decorative embellishments were the most prominent practitioners of trompe-l'oeil around the Cubists in France, painters such as Harnett, Haberle, and Pito in the US were attracting a great deal of popular attention, if not favorable critical reviews. Their paintings were exhibited in public establishments such as bars, hotels, and banks. A group of Harnett's paintings, including the one on the right there, After the Hunt, was a sensational attraction at Stewart's Bar in New York for decades. Lithographic copies of their work, such as the one on the left, circulated widely. Advertisers took up trompe-l'oeil motifs in commercial trade cards and magazine illustrations, such as those you see on the screen for bitters and packaged foods. Exempted from military service for health reasons, Duchamp spent the war years, 1915 to 1918, in New York, and he returned for long periods in succeeding years. He was much more likely to be exposed to this commercial culture of trompe-l'oeil than his colleagues in Paris, and it may have given that style a different status for him than artisan wallpapers in Paris would have. Some of Duchamp's ready-mades were drawn from the commercial visual culture of the US in the 19-teens. And here's the last image I'll show you. Apollinaire enameled. This work appropriates a painted tin relief advertisement for Sapelin enamel paints, the sort of sign that would have been displayed in the paint section of a hardware store. Duchamp has blacked out the S of Sapelin and added letters to make a joke about his friend, the poet and critic Guillaume Apollinaire. He also rewrites the printing at the lower right, which originally said, manufactured by Gerstendorfer Brothers, New York, USA, to become a nonsense string of words. Any act read by her 10 or Apern, New York, USA. I argued in my book, Looking Askance, that the culture of deceptive marketing, fraudulent entertainments, and skeptical seeing, flourishing in the United States in the early 20th century, proved to be a productive and stimulating creative environment for Duchamp. It meshed with his own artistic inclinations, precipitated his development of the ready-mades, and may have exacerbated his doubts about the viability of painting as a vehicle of reliable and truthful representation. And I think this culture helps to elucidate some of the differences between the uses he makes of trompe-l'oeil materials and those characteristic of the Cubists. He was less ambivalent about deceptive illusions than his Parisian counterparts. They were, to him, more foil than ally. As much as he enjoyed witty and humorous games of all sorts, trompe-l'oeil motifs were useful to him primarily as tools for dismantling the category of retinal art and replacing it with a more unconstructively critical conceptual alternative. Nonetheless, I come away from the present exhibition with a much fuller appreciation of how much Cubism there is in Duchamp and how much Duchamp there is in Cubism. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for that absolutely brilliant lecture, and with I think exemplifying close looking at all times as, the foundation of what we should be doing is try to understand these works of art. But I wonder whether you can answer and take further the point that you make right at the end about the relationship between